Today, we're diving into a document that has sparked a ton of discussion, debate, and for a lot of people, a real crisis of faith. It's known as the CES Letter, and it's basically a compilation of one believer's most urgent questions about the very foundations of his religion.
And to really frame our discussion, let's start with this powerful idea. It comes from a past leader of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, often just called the LDS Church. J. Reuben Clark is basically saying, hey, if what we have is true, we should be able to look at it from every angle, and it'll hold up. Truth has nothing to fear from an honest look.
Now, this is so crucial to understand. These questions weren't put together by some outside critic with an axe to grind. The author, Jeremy Runnells, was a lifelong all-in member of the church. He was just a guy who started running into information that was new to him, and it was troubling. In this quote, this was the spark. When Runnells heard the church's own top historian, Marlon K. Jensen, admit that people were leaving the church in huge numbers because of historical issues, it kicked off this obsessive, year-long search for answers. The questions he compiled were originally meant for a director in the church educational system, or CES for short. Okay, so the first batch of questions in the letter zooms in on the Book of Mormon itself, just looking closely at the text and comparing it to other things. Now, check this out, because it's a really interesting detail. In the King James Version of the Bible, the KJV, you see these italicized words. Those words weren't in the original Hebrew manuscripts. They were actually added by translators back in the 1600s just to make the English flow a little better. So the letter asks a pretty pointed question. Why do these exact same 7 italicized words added by 17th century translators show up in 3 Nephi, a book that was supposedly written over 1,400 years earlier? And here's another textual puzzle. On the left, you've got the Sermon on the Mount from the Book of Mormon. In the middle, you have the same sermon from the King James Bible. As you can see, they're identical. But then, look at the column on the right. That's Joseph Smith's own inspired correction of that very same passage he did later on. So the question that raises is, if the Book of Mormon is the most correct book, why does it have the version that its own translator later said needed to be corrected? It's a real head-scratcher. These sorts of questions about the text naturally lead to the next big section of the letter. This is where it pivots from what's inside the book to the outside world, looking at potential conflicts with science and history. For a very long time, the Book of Mormon taught that Native Americans came from Israelites. But, modern DNA science pretty overwhelmingly shows their ancestry traces back to Asia. The letter points out that after this became common knowledge, the church quietly went in and changed the introduction to the book. It went from saying they are the principal ancestors to just among the ancestors, a very subtle but very significant change. Then you've got the whole issue of anachronisms. It's a fancy word for things that are just out of place in time. The Book of Mormon mentions all sorts of things like horses, steel, and wheeled chariots. But the archaeological consensus is that none of those things existed in the Americas during the time the book is set. And it's not just 1 or 2 things. It's this whole list that presents a pretty big challenge to the book's historical claims. And we're not talking about a few small tribes here. The scale of the story is absolutely massive. It describes these huge, sprawling civilizations with millions of people building entire cities and fighting these colossal wars. One final battle alone supposedly involved hundreds of thousands of soldiers. You'd think a battle that big would leave something behind, right? An arrowhead, a bone, anything. Yet, listen to this assessment of the Hill Cumorah in New York, the traditional site of that final battle. This comes from the director of the archaeology organization at the church's own university, BYU. A clean hill. Basically, 0 evidence of any massive war. And if that's not startling enough, check this out. This quote is from Thomas Stewart Ferguson, the very man the church hired to go find archaeological proof for the Book of Mormon. After 17 years of searching, this was his private conclusion. He decided it was fictional and that they would just never find the physical evidence. Okay, so this lack of ancient evidence naturally leads the letter to a completely different line of questioning. What if the Book of Mormon isn't an ancient text at all? What if it's actually a product of Joseph Smith's own world in the 1800s? This slide is really fascinating. On the left is a map people have drawn based on the descriptions in the Book of Mormon. On the right is the actual area where Joseph Smith grew up. The letter points out some pretty striking parallels. You've got these 2 large bodies of water connected by what the book calls a narrow neck of land, and even some place names that sound really similar. The letter also looks at popular stories from the 19th century, especially the whole treasure hunting craze involving Captain Kidd. This map from 1808 shows the Comora Islands, and right nearby is its capital city, Moroni. And get this, in the very first edition of the Book of Mormon, the hill Comora was actually spelled Cumorah, drawing this weirdly direct line between key names in the book and stories that would have been floating around Joseph Smith's community. But maybe the most significant parallel of all is a book called View of the Hebrews. It came out just 7 years before the Book of Mormon, and it argued the exact same theory, that Native Americans were descended from ancient Hebrews. And here's the kicker. It was published in Vermont, where Oliver Cowdery, who is Joseph Smith's main scribe, was living at the time and was even a member of the author's church congregation. And the similarities don't just stop at the main idea. They get really specific. This table just scratches the surface, but the letter points out dozens of parallels. A long journey to a new land, the people splitting into 2 groups, one civilized and one savage, the discovery of lost records, and even a visit from a Christ-like figure.
And this wasn't just noticed by critics. B.H. Roberts, who was a very well-respected church leader and historian, was actually asked by the church leadership to look into these parallels. And he concluded that the similarities were so strong, and there were so many of them, that they were a serious menace to the official story of how the Book of Mormon came to be.
So why does all of this matter so much? Why are these questions so potent? Well, it's because of the special place the Book of Mormon holds in the faith.
The church itself has set the stakes incredibly high. A former president, Ezra T. Benson, famously called the book the keystone of their religion. You know, like in a stone arch, the keystone is that central piece that holds the whole thing up. He said if you remove that keystone, the entire arch just crumbles.
And a modern apostle, Jeffrey R. Holland, made it even more black and white. He called it a sudden death proposition. There's really no middle ground offered by the leadership. It's either exactly what it claims to be, or the whole thing is a fraud from the very beginning. And that really brings us full circle. The CES letter doesn't claim to have all the answers. It's not a historical thesis. At its heart, it's just the documented journey of one believer who took that principle of investigation to heart, and these are the questions he came back with. Questions that seem to shake the very bedrock of his faith.
Which leaves us with this final, really powerful thought. If that keystone of the faith is being challenged by serious questions from so many different angles, from history, from science, from the text itself, what then is holding the arch together?